So we have two speakers. The first speaker to my right is Shila. Shila is from Sustainalytics. You're heading the index business on Sustainalytics. And she's going to talk about the ESG data behind Sustainable Development Goals. And then we have Diana van Maasdijk, who is from Equileap. And Equileap is about gender equality, the gender research. We already heard a couple of times the word gender passing by. And I'm very happy actually to tell you that she did a small research about the gender footprint of the STOXX 50. So that's also what she's going to present. And after that, we will have a small discussion with all of us. Shila, can I invite you? Yeah.
Sure, thank you. And just for my, can I use this for
yep.
the slides here? Or?
Your presentation is going to be...
Technical question, quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone, for having me here. I'm very excited to be presenting at the STOXX conference. As you know, there is just a wealth of information that's often disseminated at this conference. So, very excited. Well, maybe this doesn't work.
No, it's...
Okay.
Once.
Okay. So I can actually get started. You know, I think that just a quick introduction to Sustainalytics for those of you who may not know us. You know, we're a pure play sustainability research organization that does focus on company level research. And when I say sustainability, what I really do mean is that we're covering research across the umbrella or breadth of sustainability. So while our flagship research is ESG data, we certainly do cover a number of other products that go into values alignment and as well as thematic products that then align to the SDGs. And I guess on that note, I know that we're going to be speaking about the SDGs today and some of the research and metrics that feed into that. And again, I think that, you know, it is important based on the conversations that we're having with our clients in the market. It is becoming increasingly important for us to really define, you know, how the different research data sets that we have or the research products that we have can feed into the various motivations. So for many who are looking to truly construct a risk adjusted or mitigate their you know, financial risks using ESG data, again, we have data sets that look at that particularly. Oh, there we go. I can just turn to this then. There we go. For those that are looking to really align their values, what they believe in, what they think are norms-based, you know, norms-based alignment through their portfolios or through their mandates, we have a number of research products that feeds into that. And then finally, we have our impact suite that then, like as I mentioned, does look at capturing various impact-related themes, often related and aligned to the SDGs, but often also far more broader. And I'll mention that in the impact bucket, what we think is important is really to bring together two of the other buckets. And so maybe I'll say when we do look at what we have within that thematic area, our primary product is indeed what we call the SD analytics. And here again, to measure and to really think about the SDG solutions or the solutions and metrics that we have that align with the SDGs. And I keep saying the word align because while we do think that the SDGs were primarily created to provide guidance to corporates on their disclosure and you know, innovate on what they should be thinking about to, you know, enter a greener economy. You know, we also do think, of course, it's important to rate companies on that and to really assess how they're, you know, how they're approaching this theme. So with that said, we're not only looking at the products they're creating, we're not only looking at the revenues that are being derived from those products, but we're looking at holistically how a company is aligned with a particular theme or a particular SDG area. And really that means that we're looking at operational alignment as well as product alignment. In operational alignment, we'll look at whether management indeed does have an alignment or motivation to think about the SDGs. So we'll look at whether they have working conditions policies, or as an example, taking SDG 8 and looking at decent work and economic growth. We'll look at whether a company has working conditions policies or supply chain monitoring, or if they're misaligned through the controversies they have or the negative events they face, such as labor relations or occupational health and safety events. But then we also do, of course, equally believe that they should be providing solutions really to capture their SDG alignment as well. So within that solution base, we're looking at that product alignment, whether they are aligned, whether they have positive solutions, and whether they're deriving revenues, meaningful revenues from positive solutions. So examples of that would be education, financial inclusion, and so forth. And then we're also looking at whether they're misaligned. So, whether they're deriving, meaningful revenues from areas that one may find to be controversial, such as tobacco, oil sands, a lot of the negative product involvement areas that I think we all hear about within our portfolio construction. Well, maybe I'll go back to that. So that's just a quick introduction to what we have and how we approach the SDGs and the thematics more generally speaking. I mean, with this said, I think that one of the primary trends or some of the primary conversations we're having with our clients around this, and when they're asking us how to use our research to create portfolios that incorporate or think about the SDGs, while there's an uptick in that, and while we're working with them tremendously on this area, and we're seeing a proliferation of products being created or portfolios being created, one of the things that we're not seeing as a trend is the amount of capital flows or asset flows that are going into these portfolios that do align with the amount of conversations or the amount of interest we're hearing. And so, for that reason, while we do focus on this, some of the things that we think about at Sustainalytics is what are some of the additional metrics or research that we can think about that not only looks at the alignment of a company, but also the impact of a company. So what's their progress towards this? What are their positive trends towards this? And so that's something, again, in the works in our roadmap, but certainly I think that's what we hope for the market in general to think about, so that people can really understand what is the impact of these SDG-based portfolios or thematic portfolios. This next slide, I think we can maybe save and get into a little bit more during the discussion. So with that, why don't I hand it off to my colleague?
Okay. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you for the invitation. Happy to be here. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Equileap, and we're relatively new to the field of data in ESG. And just wondering, how many of you have ever heard of Equileap before? Okay, so there's a few. How many of you know what we do? Okay, so let me start by explaining a little bit about us. It was working for you, Sheila.
I think you just have to press it harder.
Harder? Oh, okay. Okay. So we come here really from a mission-based perspective. We started, Equileap was founded in 2016, and we came out with our first data in 2017. And we come from the mission of trying to accelerate progress towards gender equality in the workplace. And from that mission, we thought that the best way to accelerate progress would be if we have some sort of incentives, positive and negative, so that companies start to change quicker. And what really started moving us was the fact that there was a lack of transparency from companies regarding their gender metrics, apart from maybe talking about how many women they had on the board. but not really having much more information. And the fact was that without that information and without that data, we don't know what needs to change. But we keep on getting quite negative messages from the World Economic Forum and from other types of research that are telling us that in every country in the world, there is a gender gap in the economy, whether it's a gap in leadership, a gap in pay, a gap in economic participation. And the worst news is that they tell us that at the way things are changing and moving right now, we won't reach equality in the economy worldwide before 200 years. Now that's more than 7 generations. And I don't know if any of you know the names of people who came 7 generations before you. I was trying to count, and I can pretty much come to my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, but after that, pretty much don't even know their names. And that's how much time we're going to have to wait the next generations, according to the World Economic Forum, to have equality in the economy. So we thought we want to change that. And the way that we're going to do that is by promoting transparency and data, and with a really important tool, which is investment capital. That if we can make this available to investment capital, then really the companies will start to learn, to change. So what we've done is we've collected a database where we have over 3,000 publicly listed companies with a market cap of 2 billion or more, so it's the mid caps and large caps, from 23 developed economies. And we've brought them into our database, and we look into the data, and we have collected 19 gender equality data clusters that we use to score a company. Our scorecard is pretty much unique. We are only focusing on gender equality, but as I said, the difference is not just gender equality at the board, but really looking at it throughout the company and the supply chain. So apart from looking at the gender balance of what the leadership of a company looks like, we also look at the gender balance of the executive board, of the senior managers, and of the workforce. And here we are scoring companies not on whether they have more women, but whether they have reached gender balance. Because here again is an interesting thing that we are doing that is different from measuring women in leadership. We're really measuring gender balance. So a company gets the most points when they have a balance of between 40 and 60% in any of the levels of their workforce. And if they tilt one way or another with more women or with more men, they end up getting less points. So that we're trying to get, and this goes back to the research that we see that says that truly it's diversity and gender balanced teams that make better corporations and better societies. But apart from gender balance, we're also looking at equal compensation and work-life balance, where we have a number of metrics where we're seeing if a company is paying living wages, but also what is their pay gap overall, and what is their pay gap at 3 levels within the company, and whether they offer flexible working options, locations, and hours. Then we have a number of policies that I'll go back to, and we look at the commitment of a company and whether they've actually had an audit. Because I did hear earlier today that indeed a lot of the data that we are collecting is data of what does the company make transparent. So that is what we are collecting. But we also want to see if the company has ever gone through a gender audit, and they give them points for that. So to give you, one last thing, we monitor gender-based violence and discrimination, class actions, and individual cases. And this is very important information that we collect about our companies to see exactly how they are treating their employees and what kind of controversies are coming forward. So like Nico said, to give you an example of our work, what we've done before I talk about the SDGs is we said, well, let's take a portfolio. And we took the STOXX 50 companies and put them through our scorecard and did what we call a gender footprint of the STOXX 50. The first key finding that I wanted to share with you, because it's usually one that everyone asks first, is who are the top performers when it comes to gender equality based on this scorecard. And these are the top 5 companies in ranking that score the highest in gender equality in the STOXX. I think an interesting thing here is that we see that the top 4 are all French. I think we have different hypotheses why that is, but you do see that in many areas of policy, France is quite advanced when it comes to talking about gender equality. And we have seen that the past months also with their new regulations on transparency and pay. But anyways, this is with the data of 2018, and still then we had these top 5 performers. This is what the gender footprint looks like. In total, you can get a score of 100 with our scorecard. What we see is that the STOXX 50 is getting a score, an average score of 46%, so a little bit under 50%. But if we compare it to a counterpart, like the S&P 100, we see that you're a little bit above, but only with 1%, which we think is a little bit disappointing when we talk about how gender equality seems to be so much more advanced in Europe than in the United States. But when we've analyzed with exactly the same way, we see a difference of only 1%. On the right side, you see the 19 criteria and their specific scores that we have given. One of the findings here is that most of the green scores, the higher scores, are at the policy level on our category C. And that's where we can see that the STOXX companies are doing quite well in that they have most of the policies in place. But there are 2 particular policies that they don't have, where they're scoring orange and red, and which are definitely risk factors. One of them is supplier diversity. This is a policy that we look for to see if a company actively supplies, and in their procurement, they supply from women-owned companies, among from any other companies if they're targeting women-owned companies. And this is one of the issues that we're hearing a lot of people talk about, and also that investors are quite interested in, when we hear that there is a lack of capital and a lack of opportunity going to women-owned enterprises. And here's one where companies have been asking, we definitely need to know, or investors ask, if a company has a supplier diversity policy. That one doesn't score very well. And the other one that doesn't score very well is the freedom from violence and abuse and sexual harassment, where we're looking if a company has an active anti-sexual harassment policy in place. And the reason that this is important, not only because it's a social issue that we see more and more people are talking about and investors are interested, is because we see that it also has a risk factor to the company. In September of last year, The Economist did research and published an article to what happened to the shares and the share price of companies after they had had a scandal on sexual harassment. And this is the charts that they showed. And so here in this article, they pretty much showed that sexual harassment scandals are hurting companies' reputations and the balance sheets. And if we think about this and we look at the exact numbers, 58% of the companies in the STOXX 50 did not have an anti-sexual harassment policy. Going back to the footprint, another interesting thing is that we see really by looking at the colors of green and then the orange and the red, that there is a disparity from the companies between promises and action. So on the one hand, they have most of the policies. Also, almost half of the companies have signed the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, where the CEO commits to women's empowerment within the company. But when we see at where they're scoring quite negatively, we look at category A and B, and these are actually the actions, and that's where we see the numbers behind the actions. So on the gender balance of a company, at no single level of the company does the STOXX 50 score gender balance. 35% for the board, but actually quite low and much lower than the S&P 100. For the executive C-suite, only 15%. And what we feel here is also very interesting to look at and maybe to think about is that if we see at the numbers of what's happening within society, that within Europe, 50% of the students graduating from the best universities are women. 80% of the consumers in Europe are women. Even types of products that we think are very male-related, like a car or a drill or other products, study after study tell us that it's women who are making the decisions of what kind of products they're buying, and it's 80% within a household. But also that we have an enormous transfer of wealth happening in Europe right now, where studies from Harvard are telling us that the next generation who's going to inherit wealth from the baby boomers to the next generation is going to come 70% in the hands of women. So we will have more women investors. So these numbers of women are coming in very much into the investments, into the consumers. But at the same time, we don't see the same type of, and out of the universities, the same types of levels coming within the workforce. And finally, before we have our conversation, one more, which is always interesting, is closing the gender pay gap. What we see is that only 25% of the companies of the STOXX 50 have a strategy where they say, we want to close the gender pay gap. Of those companies also, of the total, 21% published some sort of gender segregated pay information. It can be total or it can be in different levels. And only one company is able to say we have no gender pay gap. So then leaving the numbers and going to the SDGs. People sometimes ask us, okay, so you have all these gender equality data, how can we use it? If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the easy one is number 5, where it says that we want to have a world where there's equal opportunities for men and women, and so gender equality. But another kind of targets that you can look at is number 1. So number 1 is about no poverty. And here, when we look at the numbers of who is poor, 70% of the poor are women and children. And even in the richest European countries, when we look at who's living in poverty, it's mostly single mothers. Number 8, which looks at decent work and economic growth, which Shila also mentioned, here we see that we really want to make sure that the economy grows. And we have a number of studies that say that when there will be equal participation of women in the economy, there can be huge GDP growth. And probably the most known research is one from McKinsey, which says if we would have equal participation of men and women in the economy, GDP, global GDP would grow by 26%, $28 trillion US. And finally, number 10, reduce inequalities. Here again, we see that around the world to this date, unfortunately, no country has been able to close all of its gender gaps in the economy. Some of our Nordic countries are quite close with some of them, but at this moment, none. So closing the pay gap, closing the leadership gap, and closing the economic participation gap is one that you can do with our data and towards SDG 10. Okay?
Thank you very much, both of you. Yeah.
That's my disclaimer. But
Maybe it's good to go one back, because then we have the SDGs up there. So we actually run already out of time. So actually, I would like to open up directly for the audience to ask some questions on SDGs. I know that there are some asset managers who said, that they are looking into the SDGs. We just discussed, like on the ESG data side, that there is, different approaches to look at integrating SDG. We had a very practical example, actually, how gender research can be used to align with certain SDGs. We would love to hear your views or, the challenges you face in investigating on SDGs.
Question for Shila. What are the top themes that come out of what the clients are asking from you for data? So what are they trying to filter by?
Yeah, great question. So I think probably the top themes that we hear about is indeed gender, climate change, and then maybe within that even water as kind of an overlap, as well as deforestation. I would say that those are probably some of the key areas. I think the challenge, though, however, is, and one of the questions we often ask our clients is, well, how do you want to approach it? So while you can go towards something very thematic, you're going to come up with and really capture those companies that are doing great things and have great initiatives and have management lined up to each of those thematic areas. You're going to get quite concentrated portfolios, which then often doesn't allow it to garner as much capital and sit in the wider asset allocation or broader asset allocation mix. So when we do have clients asking us about these themes and creating portfolios on these themes, we do talk a little bit about, let's talk about really where do you want it to sit, what is the intention and purpose of that portfolio, and maybe the better option is actually then to report on some of these themes and SDGs as you showcased in your example.
Because I think that is one of the big issues on the SDGs, that is measurement and also reporting.
Exactly.
I see that there's one more question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Gonçalo from STOXX. Question is for Diana. Thank you very much for the presentation and also for valuable input on this question. My question is related with the data gathering. I was going through your website. I saw that you mentioned that you use public information, but also queries to companies. So I would like you to talk a bit, how did you collect this database and the process also to inquire the companies? Thank you very much.
Sure. So this goes back to our theory that only when we have transparency will we be able to really start to have change. And so we look at the data that the companies themselves have published by going through all their annual reports, corporate social responsibility reports, and websites. And we also send them questionnaires and tell them, this is your opportunity to send us the latest information and anything that might have changed or keep us updated. But we do want them to show us proof of where we can find it. So we don't accept data if they say there's no pay gap in our company. Or we have this policy, but they don't show us where we can find it, where we can read about it, where we can see how they came up with the pay gap information. And so this is our way of engaging with the companies and saying, we will score you on this, and we need you to make the information public. So this questionnaire is mostly about a sort of conversation with the companies so that they start making it transparent. So this is one of the main challenges we had, and when people told us that it was going to be very difficult, they said the companies don't publish. But then when we say, you will be scored and you will be ranked whether you publish or not, then this is an opportunity for them to start making that transparent.
Personally, I was actually very surprised to see the results of your research, because normally on ESG there's always a positive bias to Europe, and your research clearly showed that on gender equality and especially on pay there's a huge gap. So that's where Europe is lagging.
Sure, and this is 2018 data. Our 2019 data is coming after the summer. We hope to see some changes because Europe has taken, some countries within Europe have taken action to force companies to be more transparent. So we hope that the numbers will continue to improve. Yeah. But we are not doing as well as we think we're doing when it comes to these social issues within ESG. Yeah.
I know your research has just been published, but I definitely think that we should do some, make a proper publication out of it and give it some attention, because I think some more people are interested in the results of that. Shila, just as the last question from me. You mentioned, that there are different methods on SDG, looking at revenues. Could you give us some, the pros and the cons on the ESG data and SDGs integration on that?
Sure. I mean, again, I think that as I'd mentioned, I think when we do want to offer an assessment on a company, even as it relates to SDGs, it's important that we look at it holistically. And so while a company might be producing products and attaining, let's say, significant amount of revenues from a positive product, such as, let's say, renewables or, something of that nature, we also want to make sure that management is also committed to doing that. It's not just necessarily for the purpose of value creation in terms of an economic or revenue-based value creation, but also because they do believe that they're committed and they believe that these policies, management policies in place are going to help mitigate some of the risks against, initiating some of these events, or making sure that this does indeed become an important initiative and operational business unit within that organization.
Yeah. No, it's So we did, I say, also quite some research on it, and we are still discussing it. And then tomorrow morning we have another meeting scheduled. So it's definitely something which is high on the agenda. But I think it's definitely also requires some further work to see what can be done. So I would like to thank the panelists. So I think because we run out of time, because we have one keynote speaker coming after us. So I think so we are also very interested to hear what he is saying. It's actually also on a sustainable thematic. So I think there's already some pictures coming on. I would like to thank you, and you will definitely hear from us on, I think, on both topics.